Hello, today we'll be talking about one of my favorite genres of rhetoric, the rhetoric of display or epidectic rhetoric. The ancient Greeks determined that there were three branches of rhetoric: forensic, deliberative, and the subject of today's mini lecture, epidectic. Forensic primarily occurred in the courts and in legal matters, and deliberative primarily occurred in formal institutions and public assemblies. Now, this leaves a large territory left over, and in this territory, we can examine rhetoric or communication in an effort to persuade an audience as epidectic rhetoric. And so the epidectic genre deals with the ways in which we communicate our shared values through various public acts and events. And this can include numerous civic occasions, societal performances, and everyday acts. Now, I really enjoy this genre because it is so open and encompasses the everyday of communication that happens in our everyday physical and electronic spaces. And so I encourage you now to think about the ways in which you might persuade or communicate to an audience or a public or the public in certain ways. Just by walking down the street or engaging in everyday conversation or going on to some sort of electronic space, you might influence or communicate to a larger audience. Now, this might not fit within deliberative or forensic communication. It will most likely fit within the epidectic genre. And so let's now think about some of the forms of communication that we can identify in our everyday lives that might be considered epidectic rhetoric. These can be religious, they can be athletic, cultural, celebratory, or festive. Let's take a moment now and think about public events or acts that you can identify that can be considered rhetorical displays or fit within the epidectic genre. This is really not about do you have the right answer? Can you identify a specific example that most typifies the epidectic genre? It's just a way of applying this ancient Greek understanding of the ways in which we persuade audiences and better understand our levels of communication. And so let's think of something. Have that something in your mind. Maybe write it down. At the end of today's mini lecture, I will be asking you to formally identify a type of epidectic rhetoric and then examine it to a certain degree. And so, with this example in your mind, what values are being communicated through these acts? We might look at a festival or a festi or a gathering of some sort. Now, it doesn't matter what type of music is being listened to. It doesn't matter what type of acts are being performed or engaged in by this group of people in a public space, but certain values are being communicated. What types of values are being communicated just by getting together in some sort of festive way? Now, festivals have been happening for a very long time in society, and they continue to occur. What values do all of these festivals communicate? Now, you also might think, what differing values are being communicated from one festival in comparison to another festival? Does an EDM festival communicate the same values as a rock festival, for example? You might think of cultural or national celebratory displays. We're looking here at the celebration of the Chinese New Year, which has just occurred recently. What type of values are being communicated, whether they happen in Beijing, China, or San Francisco, California? There are certain values that are being celebrated. As we go a little bit further, we might think about what values are also being challenged. And so, with these festivals, we have a reification or a strengthening of certain values that are shared by a society. And then we also have a challenging or resistance of other values. What's important here is that we can recognize and examine these forms of epidectic genre and start to discern the differing values that are being communicated. Now, this goes to the heart of persuasion or rhetoric, how you persuade the audience to act in certain ways. And so when we go off as a society in certain directions, it's these forms of public communication that lead the way. The Super Bowl, which is coming up shortly, is a sporting event that is highly publicized and popular and um, establishes and reifies certain values that we have as a society. And when these events change over time, we can look back and see how the reflection, see how society has changed, and see how some of the values that we uphold as a society. And when you uphold values, you uphold certain aspects of how to behave and act, and then you challenge others. And so, if we look at change, we can see how society has changed. And not only that, from a rhetorical perspective, we can see why society has changed because people have persuaded us that there is a different or perhaps better way. Nevertheless, what do all athletic events communicate? What does every single athletic event, a competition, communicate? One, it's a competition. Two, excellence. And so we know that a sporting event, if it is classified as an athletic competition, it should be fair in some way. And so we don't know who will win on that day, but all we know is that it will be fair and it will be attributed to athletic excellence. And so athletic excellence, or just excellence in the general sense, is on display in a sporting event. Now, if we looked at a play or a professional wrestling match, there is also a lot of athleticism, or a circus. There is also a lot of athleticism involved, but it is not necessarily a competition between athletic excellence. The winner is often predetermined in those settings where it is not in a sporting event. And so on Sunday or Monday, when the Super Bowl occurs, depending on where you are, we will know that the best team will have won on that day due to their athletic excellence. Funeral processions happen all the time, and they are a celebration of life and a marking of death. They also occur in very public ways. And so, what do funeral processions communicate? Also, we can back up and just note that they are forms of epidectic rhetoric. They do not just occur. And even if they did just occur, they are public performances that influences audiences in a certain way. Something like Burning Man, which happens a couple decades ago for the first time on a beach in San Francisco, now is considered the second largest city in Nevada when it occurs. And it also puts on display numerous values. From my understanding, there's no money involved when you are at Burning Man, and so it's a bartering system. This alone um, challenges capitalist modes of exchange and supports new values of reciprocity, dialogue, and exchange. And so all of these are just examples, and they all constitute rhetorical displays of ideals and values that holds communities together around certain values, beliefs, and ideals. Each of these performances reify or resist some of our already standing shared values. They also introduce new values. And so, as these become popular, the world and societies embrace these values. And so, an impromptu city in a temporary space in the middle of the desert now institutes and brings forth new values of how we can get together and how we can coexist in the same time and the same space. And so, what values are being reified and what values are being challenged is one of our concerns here as rhetoricians and public communicators. Colin Kaepernick kneeling down to protest police violence pointed mostly at communities of color. Now, he doesn't play another game of football after this season, but he brings forth a slew of issues in a very public way. And so, Black Lives Matter as a protest movement, a formal form of social advocacy that is at the center of Colin Kaepernick's gesture. And so it is nonverbal for the most part, but you can see how it challenges certain values. And he suffers from this challenging of some of our shared values as he doesn't play football ever again in the NFL, but he does embark on a new career as a public voice or a activist. And so, Black Lives Matter protests, whether they occur online, on Twitter, or in the streets of various cities in the United States or around the world, all constitute epidectic forms of rhetoric. They happen outside of formal institutions and assemblies. They happen outside of legal courts. And they happen often in everyday spaces, whether those spaces are electronic or physical, and they're epidectic forms of rhetoric, and they're highly persuasive. And so, as we move forward, in each of these instances, there exists some central themes regarding epidectic rhetoric. And so these themes are competition, as we saw in sports, spectacle, as we saw in Colin Kaepernick's example, and large festivals such as Burning Man, excess and exaggeration, and also dominant values. And so, in all of these epidectic displays, such as funeral processions, as we celebrate life and mark death in a meaningful way, we can note that some of our dominant values are on display. And not only on display, but under scrutiny. And it invites everybody to take a look at some of these dominant values and consider what our stances are. Do we still uphold these dominant values? Or are we challenging certain dominant values and reinstituting or reissuing new values that might take the place of the old? And that's really the notion that is at the heart of a participatory society and a democracy, how we communicate in public spaces and lead the direction of society in certain ways. And so, people riding a bike through the city is one thing. I think that this is also a form of epidectic rhetoric. Just riding your bike to work as opposed to taking the train, walking, or driving a car is communicative and persuasive in some way. And so we can look at this as a form of activism. We can look at it as a form of public advocacy and as epidectic rhetoric. And so when we do this in mass, as exemplified here by this image of critical mass, when a large amount of people kind of take over the streets and challenge the spatial domination of the automobile, uh, they are engaging in persuasion in a very public way. And so we can go a little further and start to read into these public acts. A garage sale might just be somebody cleaning out their closet, but it also challenges capitalist consumer practices and manufacturing practices. And so it also cuts down on waste and creates relationships, um, as opposed to having consumers go through an institution or an organization or a company to buy their goods. And so a garage sale skews capitalist modes of production and consumer practices in some way. Fishing. Fishing allows one to go out publicly and engage in an act of providing sustenance for themselves, exercise, or just being outside. And so it values the preservation of public spaces or natural spaces. And so, in this regard, it might fit within environmental ethos. If this practice is done in a cultural way, such as chamorro fishing practices that are upheld in various spaces just by engaging in the practice, you could see that there is now a cultural component at work for just something that people might do every day. And so I encourage you here now to identify an everyday act or public event that in your mind qualifies as epidectic rhetoric. Once again, it's not that you have the right answer. There are a slew of examples that I have been provided. You are welcome to borrow from these examples, but I would like you to put your own twist on some of these examples, or better yet, provide your own example. There are countless examples out there, and so engage in critical and creative thinking and look at the world around you. Think about your own acts, your own rituals, your own events that you engage in on a daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly level, and try to identify an everyday act or event that in your mind qualifies as epidectic rhetoric. Think about what one or two shared values that are either being supported or challenged by this act. And so this is the second level of your examination and identification process here, all the while pointing to your understanding of epidectic rhetoric and how it is still relevant today. What are one to two values that are being supported? And by supporting, I mean values that we already uphold in some degree as a society. And what are one to two values that are being challenged? And so we have shared values in society that are supported and upheld. How does this act or event or practice challenge some of these views? I noted Colin Kaepernick's example. I also noted how everyday events and acts such as garage sales challenge some of our already established values. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit more about this in the future, but I would like us to think about competition, spectacle, excess, and exaggeration, and dominant values. And just note how one of these themes is exemplified in the event or act that you have identified. Thank you.